Salut! Hi guys, this is Weasel. Welcome to the first video in the Beating the Micros series. We're going to be playing 4 tables of 10NL on PokerStars and see what kind of situations we get into. Hopefully you've had a chance to check out the first article in the series. It's called Understanding Variance. If you haven't had a chance, check it out. One of the things it mentions is not making plays that are needlessly high variance. So variance is a bad thing in poker in general. And ideally we want to be making low variance plays where possible. This is not to be mistaken with playing passively. Playing aggressively is a key factor in being a successful poker player. It just means we don't put our chips in the pot needlessly when we don't have much of an equity edge. So table 1, we pick up pocket aces. Nice way to start the session. MP, open raises. We don't know anything about him so far. Without any further reads, we're just going to put in a 3-bet for value and hope he has a hand that he wants to continue with. The stats on my HUD, if you're wondering, top line, we have aggression factor, aggression frequency, attempt to steal, fold to 3-bet, 3-bet, second line, VPIP, PFR, donk flop, check raise flop, number of hands, and the bottom line, C-bet flop, fold to C-bet flop, C-bet turn, fold to C-bet turn. Table 3, we pick up pocket queens. We cut off open raises. Again, we have no real reads, so we're just going to put in a 3-bet for value. Table 1 with the ace deuce. As far as we can tell, both blinds are quite tight. So this is a good spot to steal. We may as well steal wide if we think both blinds are tight. You can pretty much open any 2 on the button if the players in the blinds are tight enough. As for the HUD stats, we will have a special article and video dealing with those coming up in the future. Today we're mainly going to be talking about the basics of 6 max play, which hands you want to be opening. Table 4, we have ace jack offsuit in the cutoff. This is a pretty standard open raise. As for the color schemes, the colors I'm using to mark the different types of players: red is regular, orange is weak regular, green is fish, and yellow is short stack. And I think these are the only colors I use in this video. So table 4, we open the ace jack offsuit. We get called in 2 spots. I suspect the player in the big blind is a regular. He's on 2 tables, and so far he's been playing quite tight. The flop comes queen 3-4, so semi-dry. There is a flush draw out there. There's some possible straight draws, although it's less likely either of these players has a hand like 5-6 or 2-5 in their pre-flop calling ranges, so we can discount them. So it's a good board for a c-bet. It's also important to notice we do have a backdoor draw with our jack of clubs. And it's an important thing to notice because it means we will have some barreling opportunities when we do turn a club. Table 3, we flat the king-queen offsuit after the button open raises. We call because we're probably ahead of his button opening range. I see no need to 3-bet this hand for value. The button is short stacked and is possibly a fish, and by calling we keep his range wide. The flop is 8-8 deuce, not a good flop for us, so our plan is to check fold. Table 4, we get called. What is the range of this regular when he calls a flop? Well, he can certainly have some Queen X hands. He can also have flush draws, which now got there on the turn. He can also have pocket pairs, for example, pocket sixes through pocket jacks, which he decides to float once. It's possible we can get him to fold these hands with a second barrel. It's also possible we can get him to fold some of his Queen X hands, especially if he has some kicker issues. If he has a hand like Queen Jack or Queen 10, it's going to be quite difficult for him to continue to a second barrel here, as we are pretty much representing we have a flush or a strong queen. We also have turned a flush draw with our Jack of Clubs, so even if this player does decide to call us with a Queen X type hand, a lot of the time we will have some clean outs. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time we can expect that if we hit a club on the river, our hand will be good. So this is a good spot to double barrel when he checks to us. So we bet 2/3 pot, and really we're hoping he folds. But if he does call, we do have some equity. It's important to notice on the flop when you do have backdoor equity, because it can make the difference. If, for example, the turn was an offsuit 8, this would be nowhere near a good as spot to barrel. Table 3, we have pocket 3s. We don't actually have the odds to set mine here. The reason being, the cutoff when he opens his stack is too shallow. Perhaps you've heard of the call 20 rule, which states that you should ideally be able to make 20 times your pre-flop investment. In this case, the cutoff opens to 3 times the big blind, so ideally we'd want to be able to make 60 big blinds after the flop. Since the cutoff is only 35 big blinds deep, this is obviously impossible. However, if we expect the small blind or the big blind to call a certain amount of the time, we can still call here for set mining purposes. There is also the chance, being in position, we are more likely to reach a showdown against the cutoff. So we make the call with pocket 3s on the button. The small blind does call, which is good for us. And flop comes 7-4-2. The cutoff decides to c-bet. It's quite a small c-bet, under half pot. And so far he has shown a tendency to c-bet. So it's quite possible his c-betting range is wide here. It can include things like overcards, perhaps even some flush draws. It's also possible he has a pocket pair, which is better than ours. But I think there are enough overcards in his range that we can call here with pocket 3s and expect to have the best hand some of the time. It's also the case if he does have a hand like pocket 8s, there are many scare cards that can come on the turn and river. For example, any overcard might be a scare card for a hand like pocket 8s or pocket 6s. Also, any spade is a potential scare card. So even if we do not currently have the best hand, we can expect to take the cutoff of his hand on certain turns and rivers. So we decide to make the call. There is, of course, a player to act behind, and we don't know what he is going to do yet. So Jack 9 on table 1, should probably be folding that from MP. So table 3, the small blind calls, and it gets checked to us on the turn. When the small blind calls, what kind of range can we give the small blind? I expect the small blind to raise certain hands. I expect him to raise strong made hands. For example, I expect him to raise pocket deuces, pocket fours, pocket sevens, a two-pair hand like 7-4, if this is even in his pre-flop calling range. So we can take strong made hands out of the range of the small blind. This leaves him with hands such as 7x, pocket sixes, and some types of draws. For example, 5-6 for the straight draw, and any two spades for the flush draw. As for the cutoff, when he checks to us, it's unlikely he has a made hand. There are certain hands he would continue barreling. For example, his overpairs he would likely bet again on this turn. So it's quite possible we are still ahead of the cutoff. So this is a good spot to bet. Hopefully we can fold the cutoff off his overcards, and we can either charge the small blind to draw or get him to fold his draw. So the objective here is to win the pot, but it's not impossible that worse hands can call here, for example any draw. The river is obviously a great card for us. If the small blind did have a made hand, it's likely we now have the best hand. So we want to think about value betting this river. But what size should we make our value bet? To answer this, we need to think again about the small blind's range. As we said, on the turn we can expect him to have some draws and some weak made hands. And this is unlikely to have changed on the river. It is true that some straight draws have got there. For example, if the small blind had a hand like 5-6 or ace-5, he now has a hand which he can call a sizable value bet with. However, most of his range still remains weak made hands, so there is little point in betting big on this river. We need to size our value bet to target weak one-pair hands, for example 7x or pocket sixes. So we need to make a small bet accordingly. If the small blind does have a hand, like 5-6 or ace-5, it's quite possible he will raise a smaller bet, so we won't lose value against his strong made hands. But betting this size, we can extract the maximum value from his weak one-pair hands. So I bet as big as I can reasonably expect in order to get paid off from weak one-pair hands. And he does call and mucks a 7x hand. He had a7, I believe. If I bet pot in this situation, I just don't think he's calling with his 7x hands. So bet sizing is extremely important. You need to think about villain's range, and you need to think about the specific part of his range that you are targeting with your value bet. Table 1, we open King 9 offsuit on the button. It's a pretty standard open raise. We get called by the small blind, who has been fairly tight so far, but I do suspect that he is a fish. I played a hand before this session began where he didn't fold an underpair to 2 barrels. The point is, I think he may have some calling station tendencies. Therefore, the EV of a c-bet for fold equity goes down, whereas the EV of a c-bet for thin value goes up. So in this case, we have no hand, And while this is a flop, I may normally consider c-betting. In this particular case, I decide to check back because I think the small blind is calling too often. I don't think he's folding a hand like King Jack here, or King Queen, or even any of his pocket pairs like pocket 8s or pocket 9s. It's possible he's floating me with these. So I just check it back and hope to show down my King High, which I do, and my King High is good. Table 2, we get dealt Ace Queen, which is a standard open raise from any point on a 6 max table. We label some of these players. I find it helpful to always label short stacks. The reason being, your opening range should be slightly different if there is a short stack in position on you, especially one that's likely to be 3-betting you or shoving over your open raises. Unfortunately, you definitely need to tighten up if you have one of these players in position on you. Other strategies you can use include making your open raise size slightly smaller. A lot of the time you will still have the same steal equity, but you are less exploitable. Table 3, Ace 9 offsuit. I raise in the small blind. I like to make my small blind steals a little bit smaller than most regulars. It's easier to call a 3-bet this way, especially with hands such as pocket pairs. You often still have the odds to set mine. And I also don't think people's preflop calling ranges necessarily change that much depending on whether you open raised at 2.5x or 4x, so you save yourself money in the long run. If the big blind begins calling with a high frequency every time you open to 2.5x, you can then change your strategy and tighten up and begin to open 4x. But until you know how this big blind is going to respond, I prefer a smaller raise size, usually 2.5x. Table 1, we have the King 4 suited. The cutoff open raises, I did run a search for him. Given the fact that he's supernova, it's quite likely he is playing a whole bunch of tables. I ran a search, but he's hidden from the search feature. Either way, his fold to 3-bet is at 100% so far, over 124 hands. So this is a spot where you could consider a 3-bet bluff. Hands such as suited aces, suited kings make good hands to 3-bet bluff. And of course, you need to target specifically people with a high fold to 3-bet stat. Otherwise, you shouldn't be trying to bluff them. In this case, we decide to just let the King 4 suited go. It's not necessary in order to make a profit at these stakes, but it is a play you can consider. Table 4, we check back the Jack 8 in the small blind. We do flop bottom pair. I decide to check fold. I think it's going to be difficult to continue on a lot of turns and rivers. I think it's likely this player is going to continue betting. So it's easier just to check fold the flop, wait for a better spot. Table 2, we have 9-10 offsuit. This is not necessarily a standard raise from the cutoff. Some hands are situation dependent. It depends who is behind you. In this case, most of the table has been playing quite tightly, and so I think it's okay to open raise a hand like 10-9 offsuit from the cutoff. If you have looser opponents behind you, ideally you want to be folding a hand like 10-9 offsuit. Table 4, we have the 9-6 offsuit. It's less optimal to steal in this situation just because I suspect the big blind is a fish. So we fold this hand. Against tighter blinds, you could definitely be opening a hand like 9-6 offsuit from the button and expect to show a profit just from steals alone. Table 4, we have pocket 5s. Pocket pairs are a standard open raise from anywhere on a 6 max table. I have heard people suggest you fold pocket 2s to pocket 6s under the gun in an extremely tough 6 max game. This doesn't really apply to micro stakes. You should be opening any pocket pair from anywhere on the table. Table 4, the flop comes Jack, Jack 10. This is not a good flop for pocket 5s, and both of the players I am in the pot with look like they are calling stations, or it's quite possible that they are, given their stats. So there's no point c-betting this board because we literally have no fold equity. I expect one of these two players at least to call with any pocket pair, any flush draw, any straight draw, any 10, any jack. And the turn and river are unlikely to improve our situation, so it makes sense to just check fold. I changed the tag of liar on table 1 and table 4 to an orange tag. The reason being, I'm sure he's irregular, but he has been playing very tight. So it's possible he's a weak irregular. He might be playing a load of tables. And usually if I've marked someone orange and they look nitty, it pretty much means that I'm going to be stealing their blinds a whole ton. For example, table 1 with the 5-7 offsuit, and this player in the big blind who's folding a lot, we definitely just want to be opening extremely wide on the button. We can literally open any two. The small blind on table 1 is a fish, but he is a tag fish. He's playing a tight and reasonable pre-flop range. His main problems seem to be post-flop, where he is calling too much. But pre-flop, in this particular table, we should steal the blinds relentlessly. Table 2, we have ace-king, and the cutoff open raises. This might be a typical spot where many people would 3-bet. I decide to flat. The reason being, I don't yet know how the cutoff will react to 3-bets. I don't know if he's going to be folding a lot or calling a lot. But if I could guess, I would say he's folding a lot. I've seen 100 hands so far, and he's playing 18-16. These types of players typically respond tightly to 3-bets. So if I 3-bet him here with ace-king offsuit, what kind of range do I expect him to continue with? Perhaps something like pocket jacks plus, ace-queen plus. And it's not a range we do especially well against. However, if I flat versus his cutoff open raise, I keep in all the hands that he's even opening the cutoff with. So I'm pretty much crushing his range, so I opt to flat. I don't actually know if this is the case because this player hasn't been 3-bet yet. If I knew he was calling a lot vs 3-bets, calling most of his range with which he opens the cutoff, I would almost definitely choose to 3-bet a hand as strong as ace-king. In this case, I assume he's folding a lot to 3-bets and decide to flat. The other advantage to playing ace-king in this way is it is also deceptive. Players expect you to 3-bet hands, like ace-king in this spot. The flop comes 10-6 tray. It's not a great flop for us, but given the fact that this player may be opening reasonably wide from the cutoff, we can still expect to be ahead of his range a reasonable amount. If we're not ahead of his range, we likely have equity. We also have the chance to steal on the turn. I do consider betting the turn. This is normally a spot where if you had a drawing hand or some other hand with little showdown value, you would usually choose to bet the turn here, to fold the cutoff off some of his overcard type hands, for example ace jack, ace queen, maybe ace king. In this particular spot it's slightly different, just for the reason that some of the hands we'd expect to fold him out of on the turn we already beat. We beat anyway because we have a hand such as ace king. So we don't want him to fold his overcard hands that we beat and then continue with a hand such as pocket nines, which, while we have equity against, we're actually behind. So it seems in this spot it's better to check back here with your ace king high. And if you did have an air type hand, such as some draws, you could aggressively semi-bluff those draws and hope to fold out overcards. The river's good for us. It comes an ace, and he leads out. It's highly possible some of his range is ace x hands, such as ace jack through ace queen. So I decide a small value raise might work in this spot. It's thin, and the plan here is to bet fold. If he comes back over the top, we can be reasonably confident he has a two-pair hand or better. I think it's unlikely he would ever re-raise here with a hand such as ace queen. But I do think he has an ace x hand reasonably often, and so I think it's a good idea to make a small value raise. Again, the sizing is important. We are targeting a specific part of his range. We are targeting one pair hands. If, for example, we were just to make it $4 here, he would likely fold all the hands we beat and only continue if he had a hand that beat us. So the bet sizing is crucial. You have to know which part of their range you are targeting and which sizing you should use in order to extract the most value from that part of their range. So we raise small here. It's slightly over a min raise, but I think to this size raise he's likely to pay me off with a hand like ace jack, ace queen. Table 4, we fold the ace 9 suited. It's out of position. This is a spot that is going to be high variance. The MP opener, as we've already discussed, is quite tight, so it's unlikely we're ahead of his range and out of position. It's an easy pre-flop fold. Table 2, king 10 offsuit. This is a fine hand to open in the cutoff, especially since we expect the players in position on us to be quite tight. I think when the button calls here, I'm probably not in great shape against his range. He'll have a lot of broadways, most of which beat my hand, and pocket pairs. So it's likely I'm behind his range and out of position. I could choose to c-bet a jack-jack-7 board. I think it's possible the button is going to float me with a lot of his pre-flop calling range. It's hard for him to fold a hand like pocket 8s on a jack-jack-7 board. Just because the board is dry, it's unlikely I've hit that board. It's unlikely I have a jack, just because there are two jacks on the board. So I check with the intention of folding. When the turn comes an ace, I decide it's completely likely that A, my flop checking range includes ace x type hands, which may now bet this turn for value. And I also think it's likely I have more fold equity against his pocket pair type hands, or perhaps even any gut shot hands such as 8-10 or 9-10. So I think this is a good spot to represent that I've hit this ace. And he folds. Table 4, we have jack 4 suited. It's not normally a hand I would play for value. However, both of these blinds are very fishy, so I make a min raise on the button, hoping to get called. I have no plans on trying to steal post-flop. The intention behind this raise is to hit a hand, preferably two pair or a flush, or perhaps even top pair, and it's likely one of these two players will pay me off with worse. I turn a flush draw. Given the price I'm getting, I have to call. And he leads a river. So I have two options here. I don't think I can ever flat. It's unlikely my jack high is good. I can either fold, or I can choose to make a bluff raise. And the purpose of such a bluff raise would be to fold him off a hand like 8x, or perhaps pocket sevens. However, I do not think I have a lot of fold equity against this player, who is quite possibly a calling station. I'm not even convinced he would fold a pair of eights, even if I overbet. Against a tighter player, you could definitely consider making an overbet on this river. The big blind's not representing strength here. But given his possible calling station tendencies, I decide to just fold this hand. Table 3, 10 jack offsuit. Again, it's fine to open this hand from the cutoff. It's on the looser side, but it's definitely fine. A lot of it depends on the button and how loose or tight the button is. So far the button hasn't been giving too much trouble, and definitely seems to be a weaker player. The flop comes 8-6 tray with a flush draw. Typically these are not good boards to c-bet. The reason is, it doesn't hit your range, and it's possible it hits the range of the caller in the big blind. It hits his range more strongly than it hits yours. However, if you are playing against a regular, these then become slightly better boards to c-bet. The reason being, the regular knows this is a bad board to c-bet, and often will give you more credit when you c-bet these boards, and he'll give you credit for having an overpair or whatever hand are set, and is more likely to fold. So against a regular, you should c-bet these bad boards with a high frequency. Against a weaker player who doesn't understand this, you should definitely not c-bet this kind of board. You're probably going to end up getting floated a lot. It's likely he has two live over cards. He may even have flush or straight draws, since his range is very wide. So it's a good spot to check fold. So against this type of player, obviously the best boards to c-bet are dry boards. Whereas against a regular, c-betting a dry board isn't as profitable as it is against a fish, because a good regular may know you are c-betting a dry board more frequently than you are other boards, and therefore you are more likely to get floated. We folded ace-5 suited under the gun on table 3. You can open suited aces from anywhere on the table. It's not necessary to open them under the gun or MP though. These are slightly higher variance plays to open a suited ace under the gun. It does depend on who's at the table. You can definitely open wider in under the gun and MP, for example, if you know there are fish in the blinds who you can play a pot in position against. In general, I recommend people fold suited aces under the gun unless they have good reads at the people on the table. Table 4, we check back in the big blind. We do flop bottom pair, but the board's pretty horrendous, so we just decide to check fold. There aren't many good turn or river cards that can come for us, so it's easier just to check fold. Pocket 4s, a standard open anywhere on the table. We make it 2.5x in the small blind. We do opt to c-bet. I don't necessarily know how often the big blind is folding to c-bets. In general, ace-high boards are good for a c-bet though. At least one street. Table 3, we have Queen 10 suited. In this particular spot, we could consider doing all three. We can flat here, we can 3-bet as a bluff, or we can fold. And in this particular case, I choose the lower variance option. The reason being, I don't know anything about the cutoff. He's just arrived at the table. Until I know a little bit more about how he's going to be playing, it makes sense to fold in more marginal situations. As for 3-bet bluffing, it is something that we will be considering in a later article. It is profitable at the micro stakes. However, I will say it is not necessary. You can actually beat the micro stakes without ever 3-betting. It is useful, however, to work some 3-bets into your game, so we will be looking at some various things regarding 3-betting, why you 3-bet, who you 3-bet against, which kind of ranges you want to be 3-betting with. So we will be considering these at a later date. And also by extension, the players you want to be 4-betting against. We will have an article on barreling also. When should you fire a second barrel? We will have an article on floating. What is floating? How to use it? Who should you float against? In the final article, we will also talk a little bit about controlling tilts and some of the strategies you can use to solve that problem. Table 1, we pick up ace-king offsuit. Obviously a standard open raise from anywhere on the table. Sometimes I do like to make my under the gun raises slightly bigger. A lot of people recommend that your under the gun raises are the biggest and your button raises are a lot smaller. Making 2.5x raises on the button is fine. The only time it might not be fine is if people are constantly assuming that because you are raising 2.5x you are stealing. Which is fine so long as you balance your open raises with strong hands, so when you sometimes pick up pocket aces, pocket kings, you also raise to 2.5x and you don't raise to 4x with your strong hands and raise to 2.5x with your bluffs, because an observant opponent is going to work out what you are doing. Table 1, we raise ace-8 suited in the small blind. The big blind has been playing very tightly. Ace-deuce suited on the button. Pretty much always a standard open. This particular flop, obviously we flop top pair, which is good. In this particular situation, it can be difficult to extract value. The reason being, with an ace and king on the flop, it's now less likely the big blind is going to continue with any pocket pair to a c-bet. He may even fold a hand as strong as pocket queens to a c-bet. So the thing we need to understand is, in this situation, we are pretty much never going to be getting 3 streets of value. We need to aim for 2 streets. There are 2 ways we can do this. We can either bet the flop, check the turn, bet the river, or we can check back the flop and go for 2 streets of value on the turn and river. Both of these lines have the effect of disguising the strength of your hand so that it is less likely you have an ace, and therefore allowing you to extract more value with your top pair hand. The reason we do this, we don't want to be value owning ourselves against some of his ace-x hands. We choose to check back the flop with the plan of getting 2 streets of value on the turn and river. He leads the turn. We have to call given the way we've played our hand. There are some bluffs in his range, there are some worse value hands in his range. The river is a 9 of diamonds. It's not a great card for us. It's not a terrible card either. It's not great in that it coordinates the board. There is now a possible flush. Some straights got there, 8-10. Some 2-pair hands got there, perhaps King-9, Jack-9. When he bets the river, which is an overbet, we have quite an easy decision. An overbet is something you will see infrequently at the micros, and usually when someone overbets, you can immediately put them on a very strong hand. Typically, overbetting at the micros is not a strategy people use when they bluff. It is occasionally, which is why sometimes reads are helpful. In general though, when you see someone overbet at the micros, and you have a hand that's 1 pair or weaker, you usually almost always have a very easy fold. It's more than likely in this situation he has a straight or a flush. At the very least he has 2 pair here. It's an easy river fold. Table 2, we have 4-5 offsuit. Given how tightly both blinds are playing, you could definitely open raise this hand. In fact, I was going to open raise it until I realized I had already clicked auto fold. Yes, it's a very weak hand, but you aren't doing it so you can play a big pot post flop. You're doing it just because you expect to steal the blinds a large amount of the time. Against blinds that are sufficiently tight, you don't even need to c-bet post-flop, ever, and you can still make a profit just through steals alone. Table 1, we open ace-deuce suited from middle position. As already discussed, it's definitely on the looser side. There are 2 weak players in position on me. There's the player in the cutoff, who has shown some calling station tendencies post-flop, and there is the button, who was the tight and weaker regular. So I decide to open the ace-deuce suited. The flop comes very dry, queen 4-4. It's important to note that the 4 of diamonds is on board. This means I have backdoor equity. I can hit runner flush. It also means that if I do c-bet, I will have some barreling opportunities. If the turn comes a diamond, I will often be able to fire a second barrel. I decide to make a c-bet, given the board is so dry. It's highly possible the player on the button, who is a regular, even though a weak regular, expects me to c-bet this board very frequently because it's so dry. So it's entirely possible he is calling with any pocket pair. He can also have some queen x hands. He can also have some pure floats, like ace-jack. The turn comes a diamond, and we're going to stick with our plan of firing the turn. I expect him to fold any pocket pair below a queen. I expect him to fold all his floats, and I expect him to sometimes fold queen x hands, especially if they are the weaker queen x hands, like queen 10. It puts him in a difficult spot. It's difficult for him to continue with a hand like queen 10, I've opened from middle position, and so far I haven't stopped betting. I still have hands like aces and kings in my range. I have strong queens in my range, such as ace-queen. It's possible I have a 4, although less likely. There aren't as many 4s in my middle position opening range, but I could easily have trips here. So if the button does have a hand like Queen 10, it's difficult for him to continue. I bet quite big. The reason being, I expect the button very often to have a made hand, whether it's a Queen X or a hand like Pocket 8s. We're betting to achieve something. We're betting because we want to fold him off of his weaker made hands. The bet size needs to be sufficiently large to do this. Table 2, we open ace-queen offsuit. It's a standard raise from anywhere on the table. Table 4, pocket 6s on the button, standard open raise. Fold the 10-6. Fold the 9-7. Table 3, pocket deuces, standard open raise. Table 4, pocket 6s. Table 3, we do get 3-bet. Typically, when you open raise under the gun and someone 3-bets, it's usually very strong. If you open on the button and someone 3-bets, it can be light a fair deal of the time. In this particular spot, under the gun vs a small blind 3-bet, you're usually pretty much crushed. We don't have the odds to set mine, so it's an easy fold with the pocket deuces. Table 4, we get callers, the cutoff calls, and the player in the big blind calls. The flop is pretty close. It's dry, so it's unlikely anyone's hit it. But it's not necessarily that likely we have a ton of fold equity either, since it's possible we didn't hit the flop. We can still have some stronger hands in our range though, over pairs, some 8x hands. So I do think it's just about worth a c-bet. It's close though. Check folding is probably fine. I see no real reason to continue barreling. The jack is a reasonable card to fire a second barrel, but when deciding whether to fire a second barrel, it's not just how much fold equity you've got, it's a combination of your pot equity and your steal equity. In this case, we have little to no pot equity, so I decide not to fire on the turn and just check fold. And check folding on the flop probably would have been fine. It's a close decision. Table 3, pick up ace-king offsuit. We are definitely going to be raising. We get called by the big blind, who so far has been very fishy and has definitely shown some calling station tendencies. Against a regular, we'd definitely be c-betting a jack 5-6 board. It's reasonably dry. Against this weaker player who calls too much, we're going to check back. It's possible we don't have the best hand. although it's quite possible we do. Either way, it's unlikely we have much fold equity, so our plan is to check back and hope to reach showdown. When the turn comes a queen, and he checks again, it does seem as if I will definitely have more fold equity against any pair hands, any 5x, 6x, perhaps a draw, perhaps a hand like pocket eights. I also have turned a small amount of equity. Any 10 gives me a Broadway draw. I decide to make a semi-bluff here, in the hopes that sometimes I may fold out a hand like 5x or 6x on this queen turn. I also deny him the chance to hit one of his 6 outs if I am still ahead, or at least charge him to do so. Table 2, pocket 10s. We don't really want to be 3-betting against a middle position open with a hand like pocket 10s unless we have specific reads. The range that continues to a 3-bet we won't be doing so well against. It's a lot better in this situation to flat with a hand like pocket 10s. Hope to spike a 10 or perhaps an overpair. We do flop the overpair. The small blind who calls donks out, however, and he donks big, pretty much pot size. Given the sizing of his bet here, I don't think this is ever a semi-bluff. I don't think he ever has a hand like 9-10 or 5-6. I also think it's unlikely he has a hand as weak as 8x or 7x. I think his range for donking this big on the flop is very often overpairs or sets. So pocket 3s, pocket 7s, pocket 8s, and anything from pocket 9s plus. Obviously we only beat one overpair, pocket 9s, and we are pretty much crushed by all his sets. So given his bet sizing, I think it's the best idea to lay this hand down. So far he's also been playing quite tight. Table 2, we pick up ace-2 suited. As discussed, you can open raise this hand. It's also fine to fold it. Folding is definitely the lower variance option. In this case I decide to open because pretty much all of table 2 are tight players. You can definitely get away with opening a much wider range in general. Table 3, I check back in the big blind and flop top pair. The player in the cutoff is a calling station. We may as well begin betting immediately for value and for protection against any overcards he could have. Table 4, 8-6 suited in the small blind, and the big blind has been playing very tightly, so we'll open raise. Table 2, the flop's not great for us. As discussed, this is then one of the flops you can choose to c-bet against slightly more competent regulars. The turn is a jack. It's true in this case I don't have much pot equity, but some of the time I expect to have the best hand. If he does have a type of diamond draw, he could have king queen of diamonds, he could have a hand like 6-7. It's also possible the jack is a scare card for a hand such as pocket 6s, pocket 7s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s. He's not always folding these hands to a second barrel, but it is possible. I do decide to fire the second barrel. It's never going to be hugely plus EV. My hope is he folds a hand like pocket 7s. Table 1, we open raise the ace-8. Again, this is a similar situation to the ace-2 hand we had earlier. It's unlikely you're going to get 3 streets, and in this case you're never getting 3 streets because you're against a short stacker. So the plan is to get 2 streets of value. Again, I decide to check back and then go for 2 streets of value, and I believe he folds on the turn. Table 2, our second barrel doesn't work, and we just decide to check back. Perhaps show down against any of his misdraws. The 6-7 got there, and he does end up showing pocket 7s, so it's unfortunate. We know for future that he's maybe not the best opponent to barrel if he can call with a hand like pocket 7s here to 2 barrels. I did hope he would fold that hand some percentage of the time, but as it turns out, double barreling against this specific opponent wasn't the best play. Table 2, pocket jacks, standard open from anywhere on the table, and likewise with table 4 and the pocket queens. King 10 on table 1 from MP. You should probably be folding that pretty much all of the time, unless you have a very specific reason to open it. Problem with a hand like King 10 is it's just too dominated by people's calling ranges. Hands like King Queen, King Jack, Ace 10. You're going to run into trouble when you flop top pair with a hand like King 10. And you're going to end up losing whole stacks some of the time, which is why you don't open a hand like King 10 from under the gun. You can open a hand like King Queen from under the gun. King Jack is a little bit on the loose side. Hands like Jack Queen offsuit, you should probably fold from under the gun. Table 1, we do decide to complete with the Queen 9. Both of the players in the pot have shown themselves to be quite bad so far, so we do have a hand with some potential, so we don't mind completing. Given the fact both players are shallow, we don't want to raise. Table 4, we open raise from the button with Queen 10 offsuit. We do flop top pair. The big blind has not been folding to c-bet so far, so we definitely want to c-bet this board for value. You can call with worse queens, Jack X, any flush draw, any straight draw. We definitely want to be c-betting here, and we also plan to fire the turn for value on good turn cards. Table 3, we open pocket jacks in the cutoff, standard open raise. The big blind calls, and we know that the big blind is a calling station post flop. The flop comes Ace 10 deuce with a flush draw. It may initially seem a bad flop for us, but given the fact that the player in the big blind is capable of continuing with a very wide range even on this flop, we definitely want to c-bet for value, because he can call with many hands that aren't ace-x hands. He can call with any 10x, any flush draw, any gut shot, for example Jack King, Jack Queen, King Queen. The turn comes a 5 on table 3, which is pretty much a blank. Very safe card for us. So all the same conditions that applied on the flop still apply on the turn. There's many worse hands he can call with. Yes, sometimes he will have an ace-x hand, but his range is so much wider than that, we want to fire the turn again for value. Again, we don't want to fire too big. We have to remember we are targeting a specific part of his range, and it's any hand that isn't ace-x, so weak pairs, gut shots, flush draws. We have to be careful with our bet sizing. If we were to bet pot, he might fold all hands that aren't ace-x, which would be a disaster for us. so we must be very careful with our bet sizing. The river comes a queen, which is not a good card for us. Any gut shot hand hits that queen. Jack King makes Broadway. Queen Jack has a pair that beats us. King Queen has a pair that beats us. There aren't many hands we still beat. We still beat 10x hands, and we still beat any busted flush draws that don't have a queen. In general, I think his range is slightly too thin to value bet against, so we check back and hope to show down against a busted flush draw or one of his 10x hands, and he has a 10x hand, which is good for us. Table 1, the 8-7 offsuit, we should really just be folding hands like this. It may seem playable, but it's not. Table 4, we have ace-9 suited. We can definitely open ace-9 suited from under the gun. It's quite possibly less profitable when there are short stacks on the table, however. So I choose to fold. Table 1, we make it 2.5x in the cutoff. The reason being, two of the players on this table are short stacked. We don't want to get shoved on and be in a tough situation with a hand like ace-jack, and we want to lose the least when we do get re-raised and have to fold. It also sets up a slightly better stack to pot ratio post flop, and there will be an article on stack to pot ratios. What are stack to pot ratios, how you can use them to formulate a strategy. So that will be in the series. The 7-3 suited. Oh, not going to play it. Table 4, the Queen 10 offsuit. We're definitely going to open raise this just because the big blind has been playing so tight. He does decide to call, however. And given that he's playing 11-7 over 47 hands, that's not the greatest thing in the world. We do flop top pair. And it's quite a tricky situation because if we bet, there aren't too many worse hands you can call with. There are, however, some. There are hands like pocket 8s, pocket 9s, which are probably going to call us at least once. The question is whether he calls with a hand like ace-king or ace-jack or ace-queen when we bet this board, or if he has some other pure floats in his range. If he has plenty of floats, we should definitely choose to c-bet rather than check call here. If he doesn't float very often, but he turns a wide part of his range into a bluff on such a dry board, then check calling becomes optimal. We just don't know this information about this player, so it's very difficult to say whether on the flop you should bet for value or whether you should check call. The downside to check calling is if you're playing against a competent opponent, they can put you on a weak made hand a ton of the time and literally fire 3 streets and there's nothing you can do. You pretty much have to fold unless you improve. Hopefully this big blind player is not a decent regular though, therefore we don't need to worry about him firing 3 streets on a bluff. King Queen offsuit is a standard open raise under the gun. It's probably never going to be a hugely profitable hand to play under the gun, but it should show a profit in the long run. So it is standard open raise. As discussed, King Jack is quite possibly a little bit too weak to open under the gun. But when hands become suited, you can definitely open wider again. For example, you can open Jack Queen suited under the gun, no problem. That should show a long-term profit, but Jack Queen offsuit is not such a great idea. And a lot of the reason is the additional equity you get when you barrel with those hands. With a hand like Jack Queen suited, you can turn flush draws and you can fire multiple barrels with equity. It's just not something you can do with a hand like Jack Queen offsuit. Your main strength lies in making weak and dominated top pairs. So I think that's pretty much it for this session. There is one more hand that I would like to look at, so I'm going to skip the video forward. But I hope you've enjoyed the first video in the series of beating the micros. Please leave any comments or feedback you have, or anything you'd like to see in future videos, and I will do my best to put those in the videos for you guys. We still with the ace-3 offsuit on the button. It's pretty standard versus type blinds. We get 3-bet. He hasn't 3-bet us once, so we decide to fold. So we've skipped the video forward. It's mainly this ace-queen suited hand I want to look at. Coincidentally, we do have ace-king suited on table 1, which we open raise, and we do get shoved on by a short stack who has been at the table for a while, and it's pretty much a snap call against someone with 16 big blinds. You can never fold ace-king suited. Table 2, the hand I want to talk about. Under the gun opens. We should really never be 3-betting here. It's possible this regular under the gun can be opening a little bit looser. He has been playing 25-21 so far, but in general we definitely don't want to be 3-betting a hand like ace-queen suited versus under the gun opening range. So we flat. The flop comes reasonable for us. We have overs, a gut shot, and a backdoor flush draw. We definitely don't want to be folding on this flop. We have plenty of equity, and it's likely he's c-betting most of his range. So I'm not convinced we necessarily have the best hand that often, but there's plenty of hands he can have that we A, have equity against, or B, can take away from him on a later street. When he checks the turn to us, what kind of range can we put him on? I think he's definitely barreling a lot of his stronger made hands. I think he's barreling pocket jacks, pocket tens, pocket twos, pretty much always. I think it's quite possible he's barreling a hand like ace-jack. The board is drawy, so he wants to charge our draws. So we can take a lot of his hands out of his range. And while it's not good to put someone on a specific hand, I did strongly get the impression he was drawing. He had perhaps a hand like ace-king, ace-queen with a gut shot, some type of flush draw. He may have even had a hand such as ace-queen of diamonds or ace-king of diamonds, in which case he didn't want to fold his draw. Either way, it makes sense to make a bet on the turn. If he does have a hand such as pocket eights, we can fold him off those hands. We may even fold him off some of his 10x hands. He may even have a hand such as queen king, which he didn't want to barrel, but he wanted to check call. Either way, when the river bricks, all of those draws miss. Ace king, ace queen, both flush draws on the board miss. Queen king misses. So there's many busted draws he can have in his range. It's unlikely he has a strong made hand, as discussed previously, so his range is pretty much mainly busted draws and some weak one pair hands like perhaps 10x or a very weak jack. Given that we have ace high, it makes sense to make a small bet to try and fold him off of his draws. It would suck if we check back and he shows down a hand like ace king of diamonds, when it's quite likely we can get him to fold that hand by making a very small bet here. There's no need to pot here. We're betting to achieve something. We're betting to fold him specifically off any draws that he has missed. So a very small bet will do, just enough so he can't really call with a hand like ace king ever, or a hand like pocket eights if he gets past the turn. So we bet just over half pot and hope to fold him off his draws. And fortunately it works. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. This has been Weasel making a strategy video for Hold'em.ro. I'll see you guys soon.